Members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be here before you. My name is Alan Olsen. I'm a senator representing Senate District 20. And for everyone here that's listening and watching, be advised that I'm an old guy and PowerPoints aren't my thing, so I did the best I could. So, and I'd also like to say that I'm not against clean air and clean water. I really am not. Oregon is, as I said earlier, is a great place to live. It's a wonderful place to live. And we should take care of our environment. That's what we're here for, is to make certain that Oregon stays Oregon and we protect our environment. But the question that has to be asked is, CO2, as we talk about it, is it a fundamental element of life, or is it destroying the earth? Oregon forests, Oregon wheat, Oregon corn, Oregon tulips, everything produced in Oregon. CO2 is the lifeblood of all of these pieces of vegetation in Oregon. It's what they live off of. It's their basic food. So, a discussion about, oh, I'm sorry. See, I can't handle this thing. Let's talk about exactly what we're talking about when we talk about CO2 and the impact on the environment and the impact on the atmosphere. We're talking about 400 parts per million. Now, if you look at the Super Bowl game yesterday, you saw a huge stadium filled with fans. And that would equate to 40 people in a football stadium of 100,000 people. 250 parts per million is where, I guess, ideally we'd like to get back to. And that equates to 25 people in a football stadium of 100,000 people. So the difference that we're talking about here is about 15 people in this football stadium of 100,000 people, or 15 parts per million. Can you find 15 people with red hats on in this stadium? You can see the difficulty to comprehend what we're talking about. It's so minuscule. 15 parts per million is like 15 red hats in this stadium of 100,000 people. The Global Warming Commission has put this chart out, and it shows our projected route and the route we need to take. And in 2012, we generated 60 million metric tons. And in 2030, they want us to be down to 39.6 million metric tons. But one of the questions I asked when I looked at this chart was, did this take into account the population growth that we've had? Because everyone that moves to this state, because it's a great state to live in, brings with it a footprint of CO2. From 1990 to 2016, the population grew by 1.2 million people. Now, as we all know, we don't count as CO2 generators. But when they bring their cars, they bring their trucks, they need new homes, they consume energy, this impacts the amount of CO2 that's put out. So the question is, does this path that is shown in yellow take into account that increased population? This chart right here is from the Department of Energy website. And as you can see, 33.65% is coal generation, 13.55% is natural gas generation. So we want to eliminate the coal, which is 33.65%, and we want to reduce the natural gas that's available to us to generate electricity. On the same chart, you'll notice that hydro is listed at 42.88% of our generation. But we can't count this because the RPS doesn't let us. And if you were to put hydro and wind and solar together, we would be just about 50% of renewable energy. But we can't count hydro. So we must look at what we really need to have, which is wind and solar. And we know that wind and solar are unreliable and intermittent. They only produce 5.69% of our total electric generation. That means that we must increase solar and wind by a factor of 9 to replace proven baseload generation. And once again, I'll repeat that solar and wind are unreliable and intermittent. When the sun goes down, solar doesn't work, and when the wind's not blowing, the wind generation does not work. And when we have capacities listed for wind generation, say 500 megawatts, typically they only work at a 40% efficiency. So you're really only getting 200 megawatts of energy out of that generation. And also, as I asked the question of the good tribal leader, the hundreds of thousands of acres of land that must be consumed by wind generation and solar generation to get us to 50%. Now, true, all of it won't be in Oregon. But once again, we're paying for product outside of Oregon so that we can get electricity back to Oregon. Is that what we want? But yet, we still need baseload generation. And many of the providers of electricity are not able to get their baseload generation from hydro, in other words, the Bonneville Power Administration dams. Per the Paris Climate Accord, and this was done a couple years ago, and our president has turned it down, but if you look at this chart, you'll see that in 2012, China produced almost 11 billion metric tons of CO2. And according to the accord, they're allowed to go to almost 14 billion metric tons. While the United States produced a little over 6 billion metric tons in 2012, and we are asked to reduce to 4 billion metric tons. And I know this is difficult to see, but if you look down there where it says India, you'll see that they'll come up to almost 4 billion metric tons. You can also see that Mexico will come up to approximately, I guess, about 750 million metric tons. And interestingly enough, in my research, I found that Alberta, Canada is also going to increase their CO2 output. So as China increases CO2 output by 250 million metric tons per year, Oregon will reduce, or hopes to reduce, CO2 by 1,410,000 metric tons per year, or 0.0005% of China's output. So what will be the cost of the California cap and trade tax on Oregonians? Of course, we know it'll be higher gas and diesel prices. At $16 a ton of CO2 emissions, that'll cost about 16 cents a gallon. On top of the most recent transportation tax of 34 cents a gallon, on top of the low carbon fuel standard, which our own state predicts to be 4 cents to 19 cents a gallon. That's 3 taxes on the same product. Who pays for that? We'll have higher prices on natural gas. Energy supplier assessment tax of 0.15% to the Department of Energy. 7% tax to the Energy Trust of Oregon. That's on your electric bills. But remember, that's not paid by everyone. That's only paid by Pacificor and PG customers. $16 a ton of CO2 emissions from natural gas suppliers. That's 3 taxes on the same product. Who pays those taxes? We have higher prices for electricity. The energy supplier assessment, once again, for the natural gas is the same for electricity, 0.15% to the Department of Energy. 7% tax to the Energy Trust of Oregon. And that money is used to reduce our needs for energy, weatherization, new lighting. Coal to Clean bill passed in the last short session in 2016, raised electric rates. And once again, the $16 a ton CO2 emissions from electric suppliers. That's 4 taxes on the same electricity. Who pays for that? So really, who pays for the California cap and trade tax? And that's what it is. Is it these large corporations? Well, let's take a look and see who does pay, according to DEQ. We have electric utilities paying $16 a metric ton. You might see some of yours on there, such as Umatilla Electric, that will have to pay or pass off over $3 million to their customers. Or look at Pacific Power, $136 million to their customers. Now, there's no question about it. You're going to look at giving away free credits because you have to reduce this, because their customer base cannot absorb $136 million. But this is your base plan. This is what you're asking for. Look at Portland General Electric, $103 million to their consumers. Look at fuel suppliers. That question was asked a moment ago. 25 million plus metric tons of CO2 equals $400 million, $405 million for fuel. $405 million is going to be taken out of our economy in fuel charges. And this is particularly going to impact Eastern Oregon because they have long ways to drive. It's not going to hurt me so bad. I drive 35 miles to work. But the fact is, Eastern Oregon and Oregonians in general are going to be impacted greatly by this. Natural gas suppliers, the ones that supply a fuel to your home to heat your house, will have to pass on to consumers over $195 million in charges. Greenhouse gas generation by the remaining top 100. 11 million, over 11 million metric tons is going to cost over $177 million. And in that list is Oregon Health Sciences University, which will be charged over $443 million. That'll be passed off to the consumers. In other words, those that are sick, driving up their health care costs. Oregon State University will pay over $585,000, which will be passed off to students in the form of higher tuition. But that doesn't include our landfills, which is good because they're exempted. And they put out 694,000 metric tons of CO2. And if we included the landfills, your garbage rates would at least double, because the amount they would be charged would be over $11 million. So let's add it up. Electric utilities, fuel suppliers, natural gas utilities, and the top 100, that's over $1 billion. $1 billion of our economy changing hands. And this might not be what the dollar amount is, but it is the dollar amount it could be. In other words, this is what we could have to pay. And just to make sure everyone's clear, when we talk about a $16 a metric ton credit, what does it add up to? As I said earlier, it's over $1 billion. To reduce carbon by 1.41 million metric tons at the rate that we would charge is $736 a metric ton. Kind of a lot different when you talk about $16 a metric ton, isn't it? And the $700 million that was so well bandied around in the last few years, that's $500 a metric ton. That's what Oregonians have to pay. So this expensive California cap and trade tax will cost every family in the state of Oregon between $500 and $1,500 per year in direct costs. So let's look at the California cap and trade tax of Oregon. It's the most regressive tax there is. It makes low-income families and seniors on fixed incomes pay more for their energy needs. It steals revenue from productive job-creating industries, exempting those businesses with political connections. And it doesn't allow the existing carbon reduction legislation to have an impact, which is the low carbon fuel standard and coal to clean. So who are the winners and losers of this tax? The winners, of course, are exempt entities. They don't have to pay. And also the winners would be those people that receive funds from this tax. But the biggest winner of all is California, because they'll be selling their credits to us and they'll be collecting the money. Quebec, Canada sent $800 million, and I apologize for this, it should say Canadian, to California to purchase credits. $800 million Canadian from the Quebec financial world to California. California sees us as low fruit. They can sell their credits up here. So I asked a question earlier, who pays? Who are the losers? Oregonians, and that's you and I. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
We got maybe 5-10 minutes for questions for Senator Olsen.
Did I do it fast enough?
You did great.
Good.
Representative Marsh.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. You mentioned, since you brought it up, the California Cap and Invest program. I wonder what you can tell us about the actual impacts of that program on the pocketbooks of people who live in California.
Well, Chair Denbrough, Chair Helm, and Representative Marsh, thank you very much for that question. I was just down in California, and it's quite interesting. The impact on the pocketbook, their cost of living is extremely high, so much higher than ours. Their gas is $3.84 a gallon, and I think that right there is indicative of, do we want Oregon to look like that?
Follow up?
Follow up.
Have their gas prices increased after implementing Cap and Invest?
Well, Chair Denbrough, Chair Helm, Representative Marsh, I'm not 100% certain with that because I don't follow their gas price increases.
Right.
But I do know that when I was down there, it was $3.84 a gallon at the pump, and to me, that was a little bit different than the $2.47 at the time that I paid for my gasoline.
Representative, I'm still getting used to this. Senator Benz. It's hard to get used to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was a nice job of calling out costs and everything, but polls indicate that the people of Oregon want something to happen. They want something done. Somewhere around 67% of Oregonians say they want something done. Do you have a suggestion of what should be done? It would suggest that this costs too much. What alternatives, if any, do you recommend?
Thank you, Chair Denbrough, Chair Helm, and Representative Benz. Thank you for that question. It's only the first day. It's only the first day. Senator Benz, thank you very much. I apologize for that, Senator. A very interesting question. And I certainly am not an opponent to reduce CO2. So the question I have, and the question I've thought of often, is how do we do it without taking so much money from Oregonians? What is the answer? What is the solution? And the other concern that I have is, as we do reduce CO2, we imperil the ability of our world to grow green vegetation. In the influence of the CO2 increase, we've had 11% growth in vegetation in the world, which I think is pretty good because it produces more food, and we have a larger population, and food is one thing we really need. But let's look locally to see what we can do to consume CO2, reduce CO2, and not cost so much money. First off, there's an interesting little project down at Oregon State University called NuScale Nuclear. Now, we've banned nuclear energy from our state, but NuScale is a technology that's here, it's moving forward, and it's carbon-free. And the nice thing about it is we talk about wind farms and solar farms. The interesting thing about those entities are the fact that they must have a source of transmission to get from wherever they build to lines that can get back into the mix. With NuScale Energy, we could pick up that nuclear generator and drop it under a power pole, and connect to it and not have to have any transmission lines. That's one source of energy that we can use to not produce CO2. Another source that I just heard about is quite interesting. Once again, from Oregon State University. And a gentleman came to my office and explained that he taught marketing at Oregon State University. And what he does is he goes out to the different professors and asks them what projects they're working on, and then he stimulates his class and gives them the exercise to market the product that the professors are working on. Well, there's a product that's in production right now, and it's an amazing product that we can grow in-state, providing in-state jobs, and really doing a tremendous job to remove CO2, and that's called seaweed. They have a seaweed that grows, and for every pound of seaweed that grows, it absorbs 4 pounds of CO2. In other words, they could grow 500,000 pounds of seaweed and reduce our carbon output by 2 million pounds. which is greater than what Cap and Invest bill does. And this is a viable commodity that's working right now. And one of the interesting things as a sidebar, they say that if you deep fry this seaweed for 5 seconds, it tastes like bacon. The other interesting thing about it is this same type of seaweed is being used down in Australia to feed to cows, feed to cattle, which reduces their methane output. And I see Chair Denbrough knows about this. And in Nova Scotia, they are using the same product. And the third thing we can do to reduce carbon in our state without costing Oregonians a dime is with Representative, I was going to say Senator, Representative David Brock Smith's bill, House Bill 4109 on carbon sequestration in forests. These are all things we can do in our state that will not cost us what I would proverbially say an arm and a leg.
I'm going to go to Representative Power and then Senator Taylor. And I need to wrap up, Senator.
Yeah, please do it now.
Representative Powell.
I will try to be quick. Senator Olsen, I appreciate that you've given a lot of time and thought to the costs involved. And I think it's something that we've all spent a lot of time with on the dais, regardless of whether you fall on the pro or con side of this legislation. Something that stuck with me since last fall was NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information does an annual calculation of the cost of climate change disasters to our U.S. economy. Their calculations for the 2017 year were the worst it's ever been at over $306 billion to the U.S. economy. They draw that information from insurance companies, FEMA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, interagency fire centers, U.S. Army Corps, and state agencies. So I appreciate your concern about the immediate impacts of this bill, but I'm curious from your perspective, how are we already paying for climate change, and who is?
Thank you, Chair Denbrough, Representative Chair Helm, and Vice Chair Powers. That's an interesting comment, and one I wasn't really prepared to answer, but I find it interesting because I've done the research on different things like drought and on forest fires and on ice pack melting and on storms and hurricanes. And one of the things you talk about is the fact that NOAA includes those costs from the insurance companies and the damage done by hurricanes. And the interesting thing about that is we haven't had any outlandish array of strong storms predicated by climate change. But one thing we do know is that the storms that occur cause more damage because we have more people in the area where the storms occur. If those same storms would have occurred